It's the cases of 4 girls and 1 boy detailed in this report, but it makes it very clear that there are many, many more children being groomed and abused and raped, some of them day after day, some by many men, some it's been going on for years. Those children, not just abused, but also then failed by those who should have protected them, those who saw what was happening but didn't see it for what it was. Take one of the examples that's been given in this report. It's a 15-year-old girl. Her abuser was an older man. Social workers viewed him as a boyfriend. They allowed her to move in. They made his family her foster carers. The report says that the failings by some social workers amount to collusion in the abuse. That's one of the earlier cases. They say there have been significant improvements since then, but even much more recently. The case of a boy sexually abused when he was around 12 and had been probably for some time by that point. The report says that social workers saw him as a risk. They were more worried about his siblings. They recorded him as being sexually active. He was seriously disabled and couldn't communicate. And so, although this report does say there have been significant improvements, it is very clear there is more to do and, frankly, more children still being abused.
Claire, thanks very much. Well, earlier I spoke to Mark Douglas, who's head of child services in Bradford, and I began by asking him what he made of the report.
It's a very distressing report, and I would like to start by apologising to the young people which this report identifies, and where clearly systems and processes in Bradford over a period of time have not been good enough to keep them safe.
But you see, the report does acknowledge, first of all, that this is a very complex issue. Nobody doubts that. The report also acknowledges that you have made progress, but it is saying there are still lessons which need to be learned by your authority, and responses to the victims in your area are still not yet good enough.
It is a constant challenge as the nature of the offending and the sexual abuse changes for the partnership to respond and make sure the arrangements we have in place can properly support young people.
But how can you say to those young people, the report has said vulnerable young people are still at risk, how can they trust you or the people who work for you that they will be looked after? The review looked back over 17 years and yet still concludes that some victims are being described as putting themselves at risk.
We're absolutely clear children are not responsible for the abuse they've encountered, and actually we've worked hard to make sure perpetrators are held to account, brought to justice, and many perpetrators across the district have been put before the courts and received substantial jail terms. So we will act firmly, we will act responsibly, and we will listen to children in terms of what they're telling us is happening to them.
And that question of accountability is really important, isn't it? Because we see a pattern in child sexual exploitation, not just in your authority. You know, children are abused, authorities ignore them, there's a report, authorities apologise, say lessons are learned, but then we find lessons aren't learnt and nobody takes responsibility. So are you expecting, having reviewed this, that some of your staff will be disciplined or sanctioned?
We've not shied away from the very difficult messages which are in this report, and where appropriate, action will be and has been taken to consider what we should do in respect of individual staff members. But it's not an individual failing. This report is clear that the system let these children down.
So I suppose in terms of accountability, that's the problem, isn't it? That when you talk about system failure, who takes the blame? You know, vulnerable children, the report quite clearly says, are still unprotected today. And who's to blame for that? Who takes responsibility for that?
The responsibility for ensuring we've got robust processes in place to identify, assess and respond to risk is a partnership responsibility, and the partnership is working tirelessly to make sure those arrangements are in place. So children are safer now in Bradford than they were in those 2 very early cases, but nobody can ever categorically state that child sexual exploitation has been eradicated. It's something we constantly challenge ourselves about, and we constantly work as a partnership to address.
Mr. Douglas, thanks very much for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.